Hi there, my name is Allie and I'm the mom of a 10-year-old girl, and this is the end of our second year of homeschooling. Welcome back for another video. Today I'm going to talk about the concept of deschooling. So the transition from what we would call traditional school or the public school system into a homeschool environment, and the process that takes place for unlearning some of the habits or assumptions that they may have had about education, about school, from that experience. So this is something that we tried to do when we first brought our daughter home. Not necessarily in a super structured way, because it kind of felt like it went against the intuition of deschooling to have a structured, system of doing this. But it was just something that more or less I kept in mind as we were making that transition, because there were a lot of ingrained habits or assumptions that I didn't really feel like were serving her. That was why we moved away from that. And so there was a process of just that unlearning, and I was trying to really be open to the idea of doing things differently, doing things that didn't necessarily feel super intuitive to me, having been through the public school system myself and having had a pretty decent experience of it. So I had to really unlearn, mostly myself, what education looked like, what school looked like. Now, I want to preface that by saying that I had the experience of growing up alongside people who did home education. Some of my very best friends growing up were homeschooled. So I did get to witness a lot of that while I was also, while I attended public school myself. I did get to witness a lot of that. So it did kind of open my mind to what was possible just because I had those opportunities to see that. But still, having been through the public school system myself, or in my scenario, our Catholic school system, which is relatively the same thing. The structure of it is the same. And so I had to just unlearn a lot of what education could, or maybe should, I don't like that word, look like. And so the first thing that I noticed for my own child was the concept of like our schedule and when we do school. And I don't even like that word really, because school kind of just implies that, institution or that building or that, like that's what we think about. And so even just saying the word doing school kind of implies certain things, but I'm going to try not to get caught up in that too much. So we had to kind of rethink what that schedule looked like and not be beholden to the get up and start at 8 a.m. Now, for some people, that might be lovely. That might be when their schedule just is naturally tuned towards, and when they feel the best, and when their kids feel the best or are most primed to learn things. That is not my child at all. So we had to kind of get out of that schedule and what we assumed was a stereotypical school day, because really, we learn all the time. So what does that school day look like? Well, it technically looks like all of the hours that we are technically awake, because there are opportunities to learn throughout our life. So how do we make that fit into a home education plan and feel like we have maybe some kind of structure, if that's what you desire, and then but then also not be beholden to that structure. So for us, that really kind of meant looking at, okay, what days of the week are we learning? What hours of the day are we learning or doing school? And that is still probably the hardest transition that our daughters had to make, because even now, if we take off a couple of days during the weekdays, like Monday to Friday, and then decide, oh, hey, we have more time on Saturday or Sunday, so let's jump in and, do a math lesson out of our workbooks or whatever. She'll ask me what day it is and go, well, it's Saturday. It's the weekend. I don't do school on the weekends. I'm like, since when? I don't know when we decided that we don't do school on the weekends, but she kind of is caught up in that. And we've had to have a lot of conversations about, okay, we don't necessarily have to have a Monday to Friday education. Education happens all the time. And sometimes that means that we are flexible. That's the the benefit of it. We're flexible. We don't have to do Monday to Friday, 8 a.m. to 3 p.m., which means that sometimes we do things on the weekends because that might work better for our schedule as working parents, and that might work better even for her and when she will learn best. Because sometimes, especially when you have a kid that's got lots of activities going on, sometimes the weekday schedule gets filled up really fast, and it can feel like a lot. And I don't want to recreate the rat race that we were experiencing in public school at home. That's not the intent. So the big one that we really had to do was get out of the mindset of we have a schedule, we do Monday to Friday from 8 to 3. Now, if that is something that works for you, fantastic. Love that. That's the whole point. We have the flexibility to make those choices based on what is best for our families, for our learners, and for what we want them to get out of this experience. So if that is something that feels really great for you and your children love that structure, by all means, go for it. That is not something that worked for us. So our form of deschooling looked like reevaluating what the schedule was. The next, I guess, opportunity that we had for deschooling was to kind of break apart the concepts of like learning outcomes and the concepts of school subjects and what we think we have to learn versus what might be beneficial. So you think about, public education, we've got our math and our language arts and our history or geography or social studies and our sciences. We've got physical education, sometimes music and art and those kinds of things. And so we have these subjects. So the first, inclination that I had was, okay, I've got all my subjects. I need to find a curriculum for each of those subjects. And I did that. I have probably a curriculum for each of those subjects. Do we use those? No. Did I try to use them at the beginning to kind of get my feet wet and get an understanding? Yes. But what I learned very quickly is that just didn't seem to suit our needs necessarily, or we didn't really maybe like the structure of it. And so it took me a moment to get out of the mindset that once I started something, we needed to complete it, and it needed to look like individual subjects that each had their own curriculum or their own workbook or their own things like that. As I mentioned before, around schedule, learning happens all the time. So when it came to math, yes, we have a curriculum that we follow. Yes, we have a workbook that we use with, 120 lessons for the year. But math also happens when she is doing her farmer's market little entrepreneurial business and she's counting back change for people. So that was something that we did as a lesson in her initial math book from the year that we started homeschooling, but also it has real world application. So now we can use those experiences when we are out running errands or, going shopping, and we add up what's going on with whatever we're purchasing, and then she can hand enough money to the cashier or teller or whatever and get change back. Or we can go to the corner store, and if she wants a couple of treats, she can add up those items and go, okay, do I have enough money? Do I have to reduce here? Can I get one more thing? And so all of those experiences lend towards learning. And so we didn't have to sit with an individual subject, with a curriculum, with a workbook that had this many lessons. And for my personality, it took a moment to kind of get past that, but I was trying really hard to not focus on what education meant to me and what I found easy and what felt right to me, but to really kind of open my mind and listen to what her response was to it and what she was telling me. Even though she couldn't maybe say it directly, there were cues of what she was telling me about how she was feeling and how well these things were going. So that was a bit of a learning curve. the next thing that we really had to unlearn was the idea that we need to always finish exactly what we start when we start it. There are days that we might start a lesson. Like, I'll use math as an example because that is a curriculum we follow. That is a workbook that we use. If we're having a moment where we're doing a lesson and she is just not focused at all, and I'm getting frustrated and she's getting frustrated, and it is like pulling teeth. It's hard for me because I just want to sometimes get that thing done because I am a working parent who is also homeschooling as well, and sometimes these things are fitting into an already tight schedule. But that's not her fault. That's my schedule being imposed upon her. And yes, I do feel that children need to understand schedules and deadlines and having to complete things in a somewhat efficient manner, but they have their whole lives to learn that stuff. It doesn't need to happen on math lesson 104. And so the schedule that sometimes I impose and the timeline that I impose for those things can have us butting heads. And when I am open to the idea that we don't necessarily need to start exactly what I had planned in that moment, it tends to be a better experience. So if she's having a moment where she's like, you know what, I am not focused, this is frustrating, and she's kind of fighting me on it, okay, cool, let's stop, go outside for 10 minutes, and then we'll come back in feeling refreshed. And sometimes we come back in after 10 minutes and life is good and we can get started and we've got out whatever energy outlet we needed to be able to focus. Or sometimes now our day has been upended. Now we're outside playing for a couple of hours and that math lesson will get done tomorrow. That's not a huge deal. And it took me a moment to learn that and to understand that sometimes it's just because it was the plan to sit down and complete this thing does not mean that I am beholden to that plan, and that we can be flexible and I can say, you know what, it is not worth our time and energy and frustrations and emotions right now to focus on this thing. So let's move on. Let's do something else. We can come back to this at a different time. It's not that big of a deal. And then in the future, she might be hyper-focused and we might get 1.5 or 2 lessons done. We don't need to, but we might. And so all of those things were habits or assumptions that I had made in the public school system, or I had gotten used to in the public school system for myself. And she had the experience of learning for a couple of years. And it took us a moment to get out of those. The last kind of major one that I can think of is how we need to be situated to be learning. When my daughter was quite young, they would go into their kindergarten class or their preschool class and, have their morning circle carpet time, whatever that was, and sit down and maybe do, okay, what day of the week is it? What is the date? What is the weather like today? Read a book. And we got feedback often that she struggled with getting focused in the morning when she first got there, sitting still amongst her peers and being able to listen or sit up. She really liked to lay on her stomach and, kick her feet in the air, whatever the case was. And so in her earlier years, she had a support team that she worked with, a physical therapist or an OT, occupational therapist, who would come and work with her in the morning for a few minutes before class started or before she could go into a class, and they would do things like heavy work to just kind of regulate her system to be able to sit down and focus during that time. And knowing what I know now, I understand the necessity for them to do this and to create that structure and get her into a position to be able to learn. Now we have the flexibility to do things differently. For example, when her and I do read alouds, which we often do in this room, this is like my office / a bit of a kind of a sitting room. we will often do read alouds up here. She has a gigantic like gymnastics mat that she will lay out on the floor here and will be rolling and jumping, or she'll sit on the seat behind me and have a little table and she will be coloring or drawing or making some sort of a craft. Like, she will be up and moving, or she will be doing other things. And the up and moving used to kind of frustrate me a lot because I found it a bit distracting and sometimes difficult to wrap my brain around. But, and so I would often catch myself being like, sit still and don't move, sit down. You're driving me crazy. But what I realized was when I would ask her like, hey, what did we just talk about? She knew it. Like, she heard it all. She understood it. She was able to verbally tell me where we were at in the story. She was able to interact and ask questions and say, oh, why did so-and-so do this in the story? She was able to ask questions about the content. She knows what's going on. She's listening, but she just happens to listen really good when her body is moving at like Mach 82 while I'm trying to read. And so we just learned that her format for learning doesn't have to look like sitting in a desk, sitting at a table. A lot of it times she absorbs things very well while she's doing other things, while her hands are moving, while her body is moving. And that was something that I really needed to unlearn, and something that I had to be flexible to her and allow her to have that experience. And like I said, children will eventually need to learn some form of structure, I'm sure, depending on what kind of a career they might eventually go into. Who knows? She might need to be able to sit down and do desk work or whatnot. Or she might choose a career that has nothing to do with that because that's just not her style. Who knows? But it took us a moment, and we were really intentional about undoing some of those habits or assumptions about what schooling looked like and how we could apply education before we really got into things. Do I think that we are there yet? No. I still catch myself having to go, okay, is this a her problem or is it a me problem? Is it an issue because I have placed this expectation on this experience because of how I grew up and what I know? Or am I listening to what she is telling me she needs or wants? And how can I facilitate that best to have a positive learning experience for both of us? And so that is an ongoing process. But we did really take some intentional time at the beginning to focus on the concept of deschooling, of unlearning those things. And there's so many more areas where this applies. This might apply to even how we evaluate kids and whether or not we use things like testing. This might apply to what kind of learning outcomes and whether we are aligned with our local government organization and what they do, if you are required to do that or if you're not. There's so many different avenues where this kind of comes into play, but those were some of the ones that really stuck out for me as areas that we focused on and the patterns that we wanted to make changes to because they weren't working for her in public school, or they weren't working for her when we transitioned home, and we recognized that very quickly. So if you are already homeschooling and you went through this process of deschooling, what were some of the strategies that you used, or what were some of the things that you really wanted to unlearn? And if you are not homeschooling, but maybe you're interested in it, what are some of the struggles that you've had that it is leaning you towards a different style of education where deschooling might apply? And we can kind of use the hive mind and people who have more experience with it can maybe comment and give feedback on, this is how I dealt with that situation. Or if you're feeling this, that's totally okay. Here's some ideas for how you can change that habit or shift that mindset. So feel free to comment below if you enjoyed this video. Feel free to ask any questions, or feel free to give your own personal experience feedback. I love the community that is YouTube. That's what really helped me get started. So my intent with doing these videos is to contribute to that community and just even expand its sphere of influence, especially for the people that I know in my life and who might be looking at these videos going, hey, this is something that interests me, or this is something that I want to learn more about, and this hopefully can be a good resource for them. So that's it. That's all. Until next time, see you later.